Abbas, he doesn't need Alexandra and me to talk about his work at all. But we were thinking that we divide this presentation a little bit. We have a conversation, maybe 10, 15 minutes.
Sure.
Diving a little bit into the methodology of your work. And I know your work for quite long now. So you are born 1977, and if you look into especially the North American, Canadian, your generation, your age group, and especially people who are, how old have you been when you were on flight or immigrated from Iran during the Iran-Iraqi war to Canada? What was your age?
I'm 42 in 1 month. So
no, what was your age when you were?
When I left, I was in grade 5, so 13, 12.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it means you have you had a life before.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
And so many people who so many people who became artists with this background, working pretty much about identity politics around the globe. And looking at your work, and understanding your work, or trying to understand your work, this is definitely not what you are interested in. So many artists are making use of it, some for the good, some in a very nostalgic way also. But what's the point of departure for you? So in starting as an artist, not working about your biography as a first place.
Yeah. First, thank you for coming. It's a beautiful day. You're all masochists. If you can't hear us, just let us know and we can speak up. And thank you. So the question is, like, how did I fall through the cracks of identity politics being transparent in my work? Because there's a generation that's keen on it. I guess I often ask, like, what times demand what kind of work? And I think right now we're going through a phase where, be it because of like how the left is being positioned by opposition, that we're in a state of confessionals as a mechanizing our identity as weapons. So it's kind of like there's something, I'm going to jump around a little bit, there's something kind of beautiful about that, because there was a time when you would go to school as a kid and you would hide your weaknesses because you would know that's what you would be attacked if that was revealed about you. But now we're going through a time where, like, depending on the city and the context, but often, I'm thinking about like high schools or elementary school, often now the weakness becomes a position of empathy for others not to bully you. So if you come out right away as being like, I'm queer, or I have a disability, or so confessing your weaknesses or othernesses can be a cause of empathy as opposed to, so I think there's something really beautiful about that, but I also think there's the opposite of that. Where, there's also the opposite of that happening where, the identity is being weaponized. It's funny, I think what you make is often kind of nutritional gain from artists that you have looked up to or were in dialogue with, or your colleagues and peers. And I think from a very young age, like, I was a huge fan of or admirer of the work of like Felix Gonzalez Torres. And I feel like maybe many people have heard of Felix Gonzalez Torres. He was a Cuban queer artist living with HIV, him and his partner. But the way he enacted politics prior to Felix, to be identified as gay was an illustration of a sex act or sexuality, right? And Felix Gonzalez Torres somehow democratized queer love into found objects that were in many multiplicity, like they were endless in their reproduction, but then their multiplicity didn't degrade their uniqueness at the same time. So there was a kind of a really interesting inversion or dispersion of queer identity into any kind of contagious material. So candy could become the body of the lover. So one of Felix's pieces is that he pours candy in the weight of his lover who was dying of AIDS, and the weight would decrease in a corner of a museum, and the museum has the responsibility of upkeeping the quantity or the weight of the candy. And the attendants, in an interview he was talking about, he said, I was young and I thought, I would like the museums to buy my work and then give it away for free to audiences. So part of the responsibility of the museum is to maintain these unique candies that they're mass produced, but to maintain the quantity so that people can come and take one of them, every attendance to the museum. But the museum is responsible for maintaining the proper weight. So it's an act of generosity, but of course, like candy, like sex, like sexuality comes with like cavities and contaminants, and so there's always a kind of a doubling or tripling as well. So
I think most of the people don't know Felix González Flores. He passed away 20 years ago?
Yeah. But I think if I'm unclear on the work, I'm happy to, we can discuss it in further detail. But so he went from like, say, unique paintings to producing mass-produced candies that are gifts to the public, but there's an endless supply, but every single candy carries an equal value as any other candy because they have a democratic access to everyone. Anyway, all that to say that the way like somebody like Felix would complicate sexuality or identity entangled in this kind of politics was magic to me. I remember just not understanding it, but trying to fathom it at the same time, or somehow there was a kind of an embodied relationship that I had never experienced with other work. And then I was also...
Was it before his death or after? You must have been very young when you discovered it.
I wasn't that young, actually. I think I was an artist named John Paul Kelly introduced me to his work.
Okay.
I was in first year of university.
Okay.
Yeah, so 1998.
But he was still, he was already dead.
I think so, yeah. So, but I was also like a huge follower or admirer of Mona Hatoum's work, who also deals with her relationship to politics and landscape and her subjectivity, but it's never a biography. The work is often of them and never about them. And I think this became, I just did a residency at the California College of Art in San Francisco, and I was advising students. And it was remarkable to see how people would just presume that their biography is their research. And to me, that was like a very strange, and my analogy was, it's like, when I look at an artwork, I want it to be a cone looking outwards, not one that kind of brings me to your eye as a maker. So I felt like every time I looked at their work, the end result was always that kind of single point perspective of who they are in their essence or in the play. And it was never the opposite, where I think the subjectivity, relates to the work, and the work is of the artist, but the objective is never to just have a confessional. So, but I think part of that, like being elusive towards these things, or hoping to be elusive, I have no presumptions, I've had my failures. It also works against you, right? So you get written out of certain histories, you don't get into the big biennial shows that are about identity, you don't get into the Arab, publications or the Middle East, this and that. And I've strategically pulled out of shows and awards and scenarios where I'm being kind of put in within a certain vicinity of certain artists.
But this is not art for art's sake. What are you doing?
No.
You see?
No, I'm not a formalist. That's pretty formal, but...
I think you're pretty much a formalist, but there's nothing wrong with it.
It's not strictly a formalist, yeah.
But to me, it's, if you really look into, the last show, and most of you have seen it, the Brenda Rainey show. Have you seen it?
Yep.
She's, I think, your same age. She is she works with her in a very empathetic way, with her indigenous history. Yeah? So I only wanted to make clear that you are one generation, and have two completely different, almost conflicting ways, I think, thinking about the world, quoting Zeta as a whole. Yeah. And, yeah.
But much of your work, of course, prior to the project here, but also very much the project here, is site-specific. And I think if you're addressing site, there are formal questions, of course, and you've spoken about the gallery being reminiscent of a theatre, and you've made a piece which is theatrical in lots of ways, as well as this curtain. But are you also presumably questioning site specificity on a cultural level and identity, but on a broader scale perhaps, and not your biography, but maybe a collective sense of biography?
Yeah, I mean, there's an inevitability that when you enter a space, there's the collection or a commonality, or like a very, very loosely termed community within that space that I'm subject to. I've always been a kind of a guest at these, I was saying yesterday, I don't know if I might be repeating myself, but part of the site-specific practice, which it differs from, say, and I'm not drawing hierarchies here, these are just like from my experience, it's been the circumstance of the work. I'm not saying studio-based practice is bad or this is better. I am starting a studio practice after this exhibition, like on the side at the simultaneously. So I think there's great value to both types of practice. So I went into site-specific work, which basically means that I go to a location and I find what I consider some sort of a snag in the fabric of that social space. And I start to kind of explore, and I was saying that it's akin to learning a new etiquette as a guest every time. So there's a level of like delicacy, which is always, I keep talking about this, I've had my fair share of like really poor experiences making site-specific work because I was being too presumptuous or heavy-handed, and that might be the case of this too in the future, we'll find out. In any case, part of the nature of site specificity is that you're engaging with things that locals have some sort of a relationship with. So instead of a studio, or unlike a studio where you package goods and put them in a crate and they come with an inherent value and preciousness potentially, often, that's why they were shipped across wherever. Site-specific work has no authority in many ways. Like, we've been in dialogue for 2 months, and longer than that before. I've been here for 2 months, and you kind of arrive and you make your mistakes and your decisions, and sometimes they're sloppy and sometimes they're precise, but with your colleagues who you kind of don't know that well. So I've gone to museums where, you know, you really start to feel that at first when you arrive, there's this joy about being a team together, but I'm part of the team, but I'm more like a goalie. I'm not actually playing the same game, right? And then there's a moment where there's a disenchantment because they're interested in pursuing something to finish, and I'm just figuring it out on site. So I'm kind of, you know, simultaneously trying to make a piece while the press releases come out and promising a certain work. So there's a kind of a chaos to juggle. But there's been moments where I could tell that they're a little bit like frustrated with me or with just the way the work is going. And then there's a kind of a separation. Like I come to the office and they're talking and they're like, oh, hi, but I can tell the chemistry has changed. So I'm no longer part of the team, like I failed a goal or something. And then you become kind of like this guest who stayed too long, and there's a kind of an indecency about it. Like they saw you naked and now you have to deal with that. And it's really, that is really how it feels. But then luckily when the work re-enters this, or enters the space, there's a kind of, it's akin to like a festival or like a birthday party. It starts to re-enchant us about why we came together. The exhaustion of planning and making mistakes kind of fades away. But, you know, saying to Alexandra yesterday, after much anticipation, when we've built this stage and it looked beautiful, when we started to pour the water, of course people were curious what it's going to look like. And I was just sitting there going, this is so stupid. Like, I've made such a bad piece. Because, you know, like there's always a discrepancy between what you had in mind and then what comes to fruition. And of course I get impatient, so I'm kind of like judging it really early. So all that to say that like site specificity comes, and I'm really attracted to this, with a lack of authority or expertise. So not only is it conceptually contingent on a local population, but it's also like materially, my loyalties to the artwork, which I had in mind, starts to kind of tether in a way that they start to tie into who I'm working with, the architecture, the budget that comes across, and I'm not complaining, if Ruben's been really generous, I'm not, this is a passive, we'll talk later. No, I hope this is being recorded. But, so things start to kind of like tether onto other things where the work kind of has to like shape-shift a little bit. And actually, Zia said beautifully last night, she said, in every knot there has to be some slag? Is that
Slack.
Slack, yeah. And I think that's very much, it stuck with me, that saying, because that's part of the challenger site specificity. So you kind of lose yourself a little bit. I don't know, I've made work about, say, being of Iranian descent by turning a photograph from a video still of these Iranians who would act out. These are singers who would act out these picnics, which is so much part of the Iranian culture. So I made a large still of me holding a photograph of that scene from a YouTube video because I found the picture from the person who had it. But so much of that culture was around drinking and drug overdose, and a lot of them died. A lot of these singers were all singers, and they were very romantic about returning, and they all died. So that's the only piece I would say that's like identified as Iranian, but I actually don't explain the work to anyone. So it's actually between me and other Iranians who see the reference. And most non-Iranians just assume that they're my family members, and I just don't reveal, I don't think it's necessary. So even though it's about identity, it's about a network of like close identities who identify with the work, and it's not catering to a dominant, say, white culture power that wants me to not be a jester, but rather a clown, right? Because a clown laughs at itself, but a jester makes fun of the court. So I think this is the thing where a lot of artists, with dealing with identity politics, we're given permission in spaces within museums that are not about transgression, but about us enacting our roles. So we actually make the institution look better. Say they have like 30 artists in a show and they're all white, so they need an indigenous artist, potentially a black artist, potentially an Asian artist, and it's like, come and be Asian, come and be, so I'm wary of those relations in many ways, yeah.
I agree with you, but in the end of the day, working with institutions from both sides is one of the most important progress working with institutions is keeping control. And from the institutional perspective or curatorial side, you never want to give up controlling. You know? So, and this is what I find so fascinating about your work, but also works. Felix González Torres is a very good example, but of so many artists of this not your generation, the general. What would be Felix González age now? 60 probably.
Yeah.
You know? It was really not. Sometimes your work to me looks extremely contemporary, but done in another time. So, which I like that. Yeah. So, but it's definitely not fashionable.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh. Good.
So, well, it's interesting what you have said, that you are not invited in all those identity politics biennals around the world.
Yeah.
Why? I don't think that curators only invite artists as illustrators.
No. I've worked with plenty of good curators who put me in exhibitions where I had work, and that just wasn't an issue. I wasn't there. I mean, I'm suspicious of curators, but I have worked with enough of them that I can trust them to keep going back to them if I have to.
He has a huge CV of extremely interesting institutions.
So, I think that pressure is also maybe like almost twofold. That the artists even impose it on themselves, being like, if I do this, I will get ahead. And then the institutions also are welcoming of that. Kind of like the ease of it, the digestibility of it. So I have worked with people who are interested in like having a more nuanced conversation about place and location and all this stuff. But part of it is also like, I'll explain, like recently the Guggenheim in New York was acquiring a large number of works from artists from Middle East, North Africa, South Asia. So it's half the globe essentially almost. So, and while we were being considered for acquisition, there were protests about the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi that's opening up and their labor laws. And it was remarkable to me to be like, no one's held accountable to these standards. Like, who are the 50 last artists who have been shown there? You know, like Yan Vo, and I mean, I can name, you know, quite a few who, not just him, I would say like,
but he's
Fishley and Weiss, and
he's a perfect opposite example of you.
Okay,
Done for.
we'll get into that. But all that to say that,
you know him.
to say that like when a group of us were showing, I thought, here we being obliged with like the politics of what it means to be acquired into an institution in America. And I think that responsibility is really good. But since you were saying, how do I get written out? So my policy was that if the work is going to get acquired by Guggenheim in New York, which is funded by a body there, it is never allowed to go to Abu Dhabi, not even in their visual archive, never lent to them. And that was a contract that we almost canceled the work for, but they agreed to abide to. So sometimes I kind of pull myself out of these shows because I know that I'm being used in a certain way. And the hard part is that there's no blueprint. So like, I can't go to, I don't know enough artists that I can go to who have a parallel practice, because it always changes too. It changes every 10 years or every year what the rules are. So you kind of have to guess and explore and make a lot of mistakes and then learn from it. But there are no blueprints for where the landmines are, because being an artist is like you get fed a lot, but you can't tell if they want to make you strong or if they want to eat you. And it could be the same, you know, like at the end you find out. So I'm suspicious of like, when you know, when somebody comes to you with money and resources, you're like, oh, this is good. And you're like, no, this is actually like a lot of food but no nourishment. Like this is almost malnourishing, in fact. So my dream is to create a non-binding council of artists of different generations who come together as a collective and provide like counsel to younger artists who are willing. And this is a non-beneficial, you know, like it's just to help out different scenarios. Like say you get a grant from a funding body that has like funding from a weapons manufacturer. Then you can go and be like, should I apply for this grant? Is this bad? What happened to you? So I really think it'd be amazing to have this kind of intergenerational, it's also a global network of funding, right?
Yeah.
So recently I was...
the weapon manufacturer is, you know, Istanbul biennial.
Yes.
It's a very good example. One of the most important biennials is funded by the weapon industry.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So, but do you say no to that? Most of the artists don't.
I just recently was nominated, like shortlisted to one of the top, and I'm not, this is about transparency, for $100,000 US grant, award from the Institute of whatever, I'm not going to mention it. And I just couldn't trace where the money was coming from. So I pulled out of the shortlist. And I'm not a wealthy person, you know, we're talking about transparency, $100,000 US, and it was just a non-binding money. So, or I walked away from a $300,000 commission from the ROM because I felt like they were, you know, it's like they gave me an endless fabric, but then they started to tailor me into a suit that was suffocating me. Even like the release of the work was at the same time as the Canada 150 festivities and stuff. So I was like, oh no, this is going in a weird direction. So I pulled out those things, and I think I tell young artists to keep a no CV and release it when they're really old. Because what you do alone is what you live with. And what you say yes to in public is just a kind of for accolades and, you know, festivities and public accomplishments. So I think the no's that you say are actually the shows you pull out of, the funding you reject is way more important than the ones you sell.
I agree.
I also
have a similar career. But it's also the question, who is not accepted, an example here, as a guest? Can you control, the question is more, can you control where the money is coming from all the time or not? No, in general. In general.
It's very hard to know where money
You cannot. That's, you know, this is what we all cannot control.
I think we all live with degrees of contradiction, but I think enacting actively in hypocrisy is the problem. You know, like nobody, I think this is the problem too with artists. It's like the money is circulating through everybody's hands, and it comes from, you know, if there's a lot of money, it means somebody has a lot less of it. And that's just like a very simple equation. So we're part of a capitalist system. We don't live on the moon. In fact, we're precarious enough where we often want to have access to resources because I don't have a retirement plan. And, you know, things that artists don't talk about is like, well, what do you do when your mother gets aging and ill? And then do you sign with a big commercial gallery who you wouldn't 10 years ago? So there's also personal frictions that make you soft to politics or gays. But I think, you know, just, this isn't a wedding party. Like, we have obligations to who we are and who we're loyal to and how much of ourselves we're willing to compromise. And, you know, there are artists who are way more ethical than I am even. So there's, you know, and I think the other part of art that needs to be questioned is like the waste production. I think museums need to be transparent about, since we're talking about, you know, these kind of opening up these transparencies, museums need to be transparent about their carbon footprint for every show. And by their carbon footprint, or I don't care what you do to live with yourself as a museum or as a funding body or something.
But you as an artist as well, you know, you spend time in lots of residences around the world.
I do.
I belong to this kind of curators who travel a lot. You know,
Yeah.
Which is definitely a contradiction to the work what I'm doing.
Yeah. I don't think it's neutral, but I think, I'm just talking about my scenario. I weigh about 156 pounds, and I pack really light. And what I don't ship actually ends up being a whole lot lighter than what I would ship. You know, those giant crates that come.
I know,
So,
I know.
And so I'm kind of like trying to understand that contradiction too. Like, you know, I'm not, again, there's contradiction in a lot of it, but I'm negotiating that. So one of the things that we did with this show was all of the show is going to be repurposed for either building or renovating sheds. Like the wood is still in good use. All of the tarp is even going to be given to somebody. So I think there's just degrees of turning things to raw material. And that's what site specificity produces, because there's not that much precious stuff, right? Yeah.
Well, we did have a lot of conversations about how, in a way, how to reduce the footprint of this exhibition, and site-specific work, of course, lends itself to reusing materials and using things that are already in front of us, which is also very much in keeping with the history of this place. But at the same time, you know, when you were saying earlier in terms of your transformation from guest and part of team to like slightly antagonistic thorn in the side of the team, bumping up against deadline, which is not.
I didn't say Thor, by the way.
I'm also saying that's not the case of what happened, but it does kind of bump into those institutional frameworks that somehow, you know, we have a deadline of press communication, or we have the timeline for the show and the production, and with the pond liner, we were adopting the philosophy that the inn uses of sourcing things as locally as possible and then branching out. And so, you know, going into the Maritimes to get this custom-made pond liner, and then that fell through, and then we ended up having to go to Ohio to get this custom-made thing shipped across the border. So that was a question, I think, of us bumping into that ethics of the exhibition and wanting to be mindful of consumption of materials, but then bumping up against the need to actually have a show in place in time for the opening. So I think all of those things are at play, and I suppose, like you were saying earlier, in terms of your ethics as an individual artist or museum or curator, there's always going to be moments that you have to make your peace with, or I suppose draw your boundaries where you can, and be at least conscious of the fact that we failed maybe in our sourcing from Ohio, but we maybe succeeded in elsewhere, other ways.
Yeah. I mean, also like the pond liner was, you know, quite small, and
yes,
but
light.
but you know, if I have sculptures that are made out of bronze and they have to be shipped, I can't reproduce them on site. But even those, we try to ship them with boat or land as much as possible, as opposed to flying them. So you have to plan really ahead. Yeah. But then there's also just like obligations of just like, yeah, Jesus, we got a show and we just need this. Otherwise, the show just won't happen. By no means am I sitting here to like illustrate a saintly carbon footprint free. No, I'm actually just rendering transparent those struggles and contradictions.
Yeah.
And I have them, and I think, but I do think that we've inherited the dream of a generation that we kind of don't want anymore, which is, and you see that in some artists, they have on their social media websites giant pictures of pictures of their giant crates arriving from the airport, and I'm just kind of like, this is like a walk of shame to me. This is not, I would, like, so I think that is a dream that we have to like neglect or depart from as a new generation, and I think the younger generation already maybe has that. But I don't know what's upkeeping these rituals of like, we can build 500 walls and then tear them down the next show, but the show was about the environment, and I'm kind of going like, well, this isn't,
I know what you're talking about.
But I think, every breakthrough is at first a breakdown. And it's okay to kind of be like, hey, we have an injury, and how do we fix it? I'm not trying to kind of hold up a moralistic high ground of being an exception of it. But I think the fact that these things are even being contemplated, and I think they are more than, just in this room, obviously. That's a really exciting thing, just recognizing that there's a problem. Yeah.
I feel like we could pursue that discussion for a
Yeah.
little longer, but maybe just to return to the gallery for a moment.
Oh, sure.
You've made work about theatres previously, and you have a long-standing relationship to gardens and landscape and things like this. And I would love for you to show us some of your previous work, but even just before you do that, on the title of the exhibition, Script for an Island, the word script for me is really key because it's both the text of a play, but it's also the stage direction. So in a way, to me, it balances that kind of a certain statement about a situation or a place, but that also requires some direction in a sense, but it also requires interpretation. So I think you're handing a lot over to the viewer or to the community to kind of complete that narrative. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, and also in the context of theatres.
Yeah, we kind of talked about the title for a while. Script was also a word that is in scripture, and if I wanted to hint at the relationship between religion and theater, I thought that would be a fairly suitable but not didactic way of guiding people there. I'm terrible with titles in many ways. I've had the same title for almost 30 pieces or something, called Study for a Garden or Variations on a Garden, and it's a really easy way to not deal with titles, because I think a title can either like shut a work down or almost Rorschach it in a really rich way, like kind of reflect it by making as much space through language or imagination as the artwork itself in the space. So I'm always fearful of like, shutting it down past itself even, or with titles. So I've settled for studies and variations because I also think they allow the viewer to kind of be more forgiving with the work, so it's not so conclusive in its ambition. It's still in the phase of becoming. So if it's a study for a garden, that's, it's like it's potentially forgiven for its mistakes or something. Yeah, so I was going to call the show Study for a Garden. I think you were like, no. And so just reading from theater and stuff like that, and reading about theater, those words kind of stuck out. I wanted to call it Script for a Landscape, but it sounded too much like other words I've named landscapes. And so it was a pretty simple decision in many ways. But yeah, there's also, I think much of the show has this feeling like you just arrived and something has already happened, and you just arrived and something will happen. So you're never in the now with the work, right? So there could be a play, or somebody was watering a garden, or it's the runoff water from some fish co-op, or there's just this kind of like flow happening. There was an activity, or there might become an activity in the space. So script was kind of that kind of preliminary because also I was just listening to a podcast and they were talking about how like you would never read a play in Greek times. You would only they were illiterate, most of them, so they would just watch a play. A play was something that you would see. It's never something you would read. Script became, and then they decided to actually print script and have playwright become public domain. That just never existed before. So in this case, I guess the opposite. There's no script. It's just insinuated in the title, and the play is there.
Yeah, it's this space of anticipation in a way, or like we talked about it being a space of suspension where something may have just happened, like you said, or just be just about to happen. But you're mentioning just Greek theater, and then also Greek theater was a lot about catharsis and coming together as a collective and experiencing something with your fellow community members that would bring you through a difficult period or bring you to a new understanding. We've talked a lot about kind of collective ideas or ideas of community on a much broader scale. Could you speak a little bit about that?
I mean, I've never been a religious person, so I've never been part of a community like that. I've lived in many different countries and many different cities within Canada and traveled plenty. So I never really have a space of ritual outside the art gallery, in fact. And now that I'm a little bit older, I don't even go to clubs, but I remember being younger and going to like smaller clubs. And I think that's a space of ritual, right? Like it was really nice because Theaster Gates was talking about how when he's an artist based on Chicago, Theaster Gates, and he was talking about how when a subjugated or like a oppressed person goes to a club, they're almost in an act of pleasure reenacting preparatory behavior for a battle, right? Not only just like the love of being there and dancing and being an erotic subject that's having pleasure run through their body, but with other people too. And that is either both nutritional, or it's simultaneously both nutritional, but it's also like the body activity that teaches you to be nimble for a fight. Now, I don't know if he said all that, but I'd like to expand on it. So I think I was part of a kind of a space of ritual like that. And I think obviously galleries are spaces of ritual, and we participate in those. So that's why in the case of here, I was more interested in like these features that are architectural about ritual, as opposed to my opinion into what that ritual means or a judgment on it. So it's kind of like an observation of what infrastructure creates ritual here in particular, as opposed to what that ritual means or what it does. And I think, we're at a time where you can't talk about a place in Canada without talking about indigeneity. And I think that's a really significant part of, and a really actually incredible and proud and enriching moment in Canadian kind of making, or whatever, Canadian subject making or subject making in Canada, where we are, conscientious of like what we're denying essentially. And I think in the case of this show, I've made work that is, I've made work where it deals with issues of indigeneity and colonization through like using the sounds of invasive bird species inside of trees outside the Vancouver Art Gallery that used to be a courthouse where a lot of Indigenous people were tried. So we installed like these speakers that would, turn into this huge crescendo of invasive bird species chirping at the same time of different kinds that were brought in after contact. So as a kind of an allegorical way, I'm interested in those things very much. I don't speak for Indigenous people, but I'm interested in that moment in history and how we can move on or reconcile or be responsible. So that, to be transparent, part of me also felt very much like I have to deal with indigeneity if I'm dealing with what it means to be on an island in Canada, because there were Indigenous people across this country. But I think it was also important for me not to, I make a lot of work that has a lot of politics in it, but there's also moments of like being an observer without politicizing my position as much. But there is a flag post in the gallery, and that is a ship's mast. So there is a kind of a journey within that of contact, of nation build, like asserting nationhood over a pre-existing nation or nations. So I did it's like there's a kind of a ghost in the gallery, and that's the flag post maybe.
Right.
I don't wind makes you mad in a great way. Does that answer your question? If I don't answer your questions, just call me on it.
Come on, you control.
Oh.
So,
Well, it would be really nice to open it up to the audience as well, but maybe do you want to speak a little bit about...
Yeah, I'll just show this work too, if that's okay. Yeah, so this is actually still in front of the Wells House.
you should go there.
If you get a chance, if it's not terribly windy, this was actually opened last night, and the wind got pretty bad. This is 12 feet by 20 feet wide. Those are black theater curtains, they're velvet. Anyway, at 4:30 in the morning, I went outside. The rain was so hard that it was hurting my eyes, and I was climbing the scaffolding trying to like wrap this thing up.
We're turning you into a performance artist. That's what we're doing.
So actually, what's been interesting is that I started this work about just kind of trying to like mostly, I'm just going to show you some pictures because they're here. I don't even know how to do this. View. Full screen. You know, I've been that person who sits there and is just like, it's just right there.
It's just because Erica shares me
Yeah.
3 minutes before.
So the objective was to put the theaters at the edge of the waters and it's facing the boats. So the entire island becomes a kind of a backdrop of a stage and the front becomes a proscenium, which is that space between the audience and the curtain. So that's what the beachfront is essentially. I kind of put this work up really just thinking about theater, but then, you know, I kind of think about now, in retrospect, about the neighbors. That's the Wells House. Like, a whole lot of my feelings are in that space. It's very strange to be in that house. It's, yeah, possessed. I am possessed, not it. I love the Wells people. I don't even know them, but yeah. However they conceived inhabiting and holding and making room is remarkable. Yeah. Actually, the house is built like a boat. I should have brought a picture of the banister. It's so low. It looks like a punt. So anyway, so I put this piece up, really just thinking about theater, but then it ended up, you know, over time acting more and more like a sail. And then I kind of indirectly fell into this moment where I go up there when the weather's bad, and I kind of reel in the sail, and I look like I'm in a scripted theater act, pretending to be a sailor or something. So, yeah, so that's there, and it will be there for a while, I guess. Yeah, they're repurposed theater curtains. How are you guys doing? I mean, you don't have to continue if everyone's tired.
We're happy, keep going. Has that moved? Abbas? Where is the house now?
Oh, it's just the cameras on the opposite
Yeah.
side. Like
It's not a mobile sculpture.
Yes,
Yeah.
it doesn't look easy to move.
what is this? Oh yeah, this.
But about the Wells House?
Yeah.
Ria, the filmmaker, I forget her last name.
Tajiri.
Yeah, and she was there, and we had a nice little friendship. It was really great having her here. But she felt the same way. And when I was in the Jenny Keith house, this feeling that you have in the house itself. And she was just overwhelmed by being in that house, and of course me in the Jenny Keith house. And I told her, it's like you fall in love inside there. And it's just, so we kind of had the same experience there. So, and I had it in another house. And it's just really, it's incredible to, you know, come so far and end up in a space and feel that.
Yeah, it's been an interesting experience too, because when I left, like when we fled Iran during the war or just at the end of the war, we moved to different countries, and then we moved from there to Canada, and within Canada, like we moved here to Windsor, Ontario, then London, Ontario, and then I took off and went to Victoria, Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, and now back to Montreal. But every time I left and I came back and visited, my mom had moved to a different house. So I've never returned to a house ever in my life, or even to a city potentially. Like I've never returned. And this is the first time I've returned to a house. This is my second residency there.
Okay.
And it's a kind of a funny thing. And I was saying this, my partner was like, you want to stay here? And I really do. And he's like, it's just an island full of, and he's white, he goes, it's just an island full of white people. You don't like nobody, and this is home. And I was like, strangely enough, in its oddity, it is what I know, actually. Like I've
Yeah.
lived in Sweden, I've lived in Canada, that foreignness is almost like the most familiar I had in a weird way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
no, I get it, even though I'm white. Sincerely, I do. It's really, and Rhea, of course, Japanese, is like, she had sense that, I don't want to speak for her, but had that same kind of sense.
Yeah, in the next, I'm here for another, I think, 7
But this
days.
is also a work about. So
Yeah,
this is
yeah,
all-
right, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I'm here for another 7 or 8 days, and I'm trying to understand how do you document the interior of a house. In particular, these houses, and I like to do portraits of them, but I don't mean like visual portraits. It's like, there are other artists in this room who are in these houses, and I've been coming for this is my 3rd time, so it's been 6 years. And every time I come, I know almost who was here, and these are creative bodies, and they're often precarious bodies, and they're often nomadic bodies, but rarely do we all end up being cared for by the same house. So I remember going down the stairs and touching the railing and being like, Janice was touching this railing.
Yeah.
And then it's like, so I'm trying to understand, like, how can I write and document this house to talk about that care of nomadic, precarious, artistic makers, So that's my struggle right now. It's like, how do you deal with these houses as a way to render them visible? Yeah, without being sentimental. I don't have the tools for it yet. I'm going to go through a few images quickly, and if you have any questions, just 2 bodies of work to contextualize this exhibition. In some ways, this exhibition is a kind of a midpoint between the two, which is really funny. This was in 2012. It's funny because you think you're coming up with, you think you're solving new problems, but actually when you look back, you realize the problem's always been the same. It's just your solutions keep changing, and you're kind of always coming back to the same way of like making things matter or sense in some ways, or how do you gather meaning in different contexts. And so this is I just realized how similar these 2 works are together to what we have in that show. So I was invited in 2012 to Delphina Foundation in London, UK to do a residency for 3 months, and then they had just purchased this adjacent house. It's in near Victoria Station, and they were going to just renovate it so they could become a residency house, but it was a girls' missionary kind of school program for 50-something years, I think, and it was untouched. So they asked me to do an installation, and of course, as soon as you think about installing things that are of the house in the house, it becomes a biographical, kind of like revealing the ghost or the occupant, and I was really hesitant about that. So we just removed all the furniture out of the house and kept all the carpets, all the wall paint, everything the same. There was an adjacent office next to this house, and basically you went there and you got a key and you went into this house next door. There was no gallery attendant, nothing, so you just kind of experienced it. So this is when you first walk in. I've been working with plant life for a long time, not from a sentimental point of view. These are called Leylandii trees, and they're a type of this kind of evergreen hedging that people use. But in UK, they actually have a bylaw because there was a conflict between 2 neighbors and a man was murdered because these trees grow so rapidly that they obstruct enough light that the neighbor will just kind of be deprived of light. But hedging has a history of, breaking up the commons essentially and privatizing them. So these hedges were initially put in to prevent the herding of animals became like trespassing, and gleaning of food from the commons, from the land, became theft. So I was really interested in hedges because it's kind of like using nature to naturalize an oppressive system. So when you're standing next to this, you don't say, oh, they're trying to keep me out. You go, oh, these are just beautiful trees. So it's like kind of a soft power, but it's actually quite aggressive. So I decided, and of course this is in London, UK. From this house you could see the Buckingham Palace. That's how close it is to the Buckingham Gardens. So of course going to UK and thinking about colonization and gardening as like the most ultimate act of civility, I was drawn to this kind of history of certain plant life. So anyway, you go in, so what happened was it's almost like the garden has moved into the house or just like pulled back enough that you have to trespass twice. First the entrance, then the front lawn. and then you enter, that's the hedge behind you, you enter this room where it's a little bit hard to explain site-specific work because it's about the experience. So I'm just going to translate the work and illustrate it essentially. But so you come in and this table was there. There's a system of water running through this piece that you can't see, but basically on the roof, on the ceiling, with cinnamon, coffee, and turmeric and oil, I made a fake stain. And then below that is this table, which has been slanted, the front legs have been cut off. And it basically has the gardener's tools, and that's all that is there. But water from this front bucket, this black one, goes up the leg of the table and then through a small hole, bear with me. You're like, why? Wets, I know. Don't get me started. It wets the top cloth, and then that gradually drips water to the second cloth, and then that drips into the bucket. So you hear this dripping sound, but there's an incongruity between the ceiling because there's no drips coming, but you watch the drip and waiting for it to come down. This is actually, this is 2012, so we're still talking Blair, I think. Blair was in power, I think.
Wow. Okay.
Tony Blair, and I was really interested in like the relationship between waterboarding and the torture devices that they use against Iraqis. So this is a waterboarding table. It's based on an image I found, a makeshift waterboarding table. But at the same time, like a lot of language of like homegrown terrorism and horticulture was coming into like the invasive and the native and all this stuff. But I didn't explain this. You just came in and this is actually called Leak, which was more about the confession of leaking of information. And then you see this work, and then you turn around and you leave. And then you go up the stairs, past the hedges, and then this carpet was already in the house. It's a kind of a machine-made Orientalist kind of carpet with these door carvings that you see on the side. The door has, the light's a little bit washing this out, but so I devised a way to plant English ivy, which is the most invasive plant species in the world, into the floor. This is living garden for 2.5 months. These ivy were growing, and the floor is not compromised, so you could walk everywhere. But then, of course, they started to kind of mimic the pattern of the carpet itself. And what's nice was that some people would come in and not see it and just turn around. I purposely bought this kind of lighter ivy as opposed to the dark one, so it would blend in. And then you went to the 3rd floor bedroom. This is the original floor. This is exactly how I received the room. And you can hear the audio. This was on for 3 months, 2.5 months, or however long the show was up. This is called Fountain. So it was really nice because when you were downstairs, you could hear the water upstairs. So it would draw you upstairs without any kind of didactic floor plans or anything like that. And then this is the basement, which is where the kitchen was. This show was called Study for a Garden, by the way. I'm not joking. And this is called Dirt Table, and it's 1 ton, almost 1 ton of topsoil on tabletop. And it's held together with just pressure and water. So basically, I build a mold and I compress the soil. It's a technique called earth ramming, and it's just held together. But it's tall enough where a body could potentially be imagined inside of it. And it's 6 feet by 3 feet, 2.5 feet or so, yeah. And then I'm going to just show another piece that this was the show I did before I came here. I've been looking at this photograph for many years. This photograph was taken in 2003 after the Iraq invasion. And this photograph is taken by Corinne Wagner. She lives in the States. She works for American Blue Shield, which is basically the equivalent of UNESCO for cultural heritage. And she went to the Baghdad Museum and took this photograph right after the looting happened. And you can see, so that is the main entrance that they broke into with the green velvet curtains. That's a picture of Saddam Hussein. Those bookshelves or vitrines have been pushed to block the entrance from people breaking in, so they broke in through another way. I was looking at this photograph because I just appreciate the museum codes in there in a slight state of disarray. Like you could, it's not chaos. It's not, there are rooms I have photographs of that are just like in shambles. And I thought you could almost walk in here without not knowing what's happening as far as like, again, it's that kind of like something just happened or something is about to happen potentially. This is the installation of the Wattis Institute that I just opened. It just closed actually. But so I waited to make this work in the United States for the first time because I was interested in the inheritance of a history that you're participating in. But in the case of certain countries like America or Canada, we don't inherit that the same way, right? Like Americans don't get to see the chaos they've left in Iraq because of their election system. What's interesting is that as a Middle Eastern man, if some guerrilla faction in Afghanistan somewhere, I'm Iranian, attacks some random embassy as a terrorist act in, say, Vienna or Toronto, I bear the burden of that responsibility when I walk down the street and I see the antagonism in people's eyes. But a collection of people have cast votes for George W. Bush. They bombed Iraq, killed millions, and then they went back and re-elected him. And then they continued this war, but nobody feels a sense of responsibility. Of course, a lot of people do. This is an overstatement. But the degree of responsibility that individuals feel is not transparent in the sense that nobody goes up to America and say, did you vote for Bush twice? Not just once, but twice. And are you not feeling somehow implicated in this history we've created, or this contemporary? Because Iraq is in shambles, and it's also disappearing. It's not popular content anymore on the news. Anyway, this is called Cast for a Folly. So I'll just quickly go through this piece. This is to scale for the lion that you saw in the photograph. That lion is made out of stone. I reproduced this lion out of cob, which is the most ancient way of making sculpture or architecture. And basically, I was trying to age the lion or make it even more precarious than the stone. I also had reticence about making replicas of sculptures like this lion, but I found out that most of the museums that are in precarious countries or climates, they tend to show fakes. So that kind of opened up a permission for me to say, well, if there's no real there, then any fake is a real fake. So I could just make this sculpture and not feel like I'm misplacing the real thing or I'm making a copy. It's like every single one of them is a copy, essentially. I'm pretty sure that lion in the museum is real, by the way. But it's art, so it can be like stretchy and slippery and sticky. So these bricks, which were in the photograph, are made out of unfired clay. That is a piece of foam over there. Often museums, when they're going to be looted or attacked during war, they'll set foam in front of sculptures, so if they fall, that they'll collapse on foam instead of shatter. This is called Cast for a Folly, the whole show. It's one work. But so you enter as a viewer, but gradually you become maybe an actor in this transition. So I'll just show you some examples of. I didn't know how to focus on both images, so I just compromised for this. There's no artificial lighting except for the two sconces that you'll see here. We just kept those. See at the bottom. So that's the only light source in the gallery with a skylight. So anyway, that's to give you a sense of scale. So I wanted to be true to the room, but to put a picture of Saddam Hussein in a frame and then put it on the wall seemed like the most ludicrous thing, because I'm not vouching for Saddam Hussein. I think he's a tyrant, and I don't want to grant him that. So I decided to print the entire back wall from that image on this gauze, and by default, his image was in the room of low res based on what was on the wall already. So that's a print of the image on the fabric. And then those who know construction, like the doors of that gate are made out of actually it's the same strand board we use for the stained glass here. So anyway, so as you enter, the material in the show starts to fall apart. So this is the other side of the lion with the cob showing. And what were pillars there are actually all empty. this is the first bench you encounter. Of course, there's dust everywhere. But the second set of benches, because you enter them this way, when you turn around, you realize that actually there's content being like looted from the museum itself. So that table, whatever you don't see in the photograph, I did not produce. So this is the back of it, that's the front. This is grass from a region from San Francisco where it used to be an ex-military zone, but now it houses really wealthy houses, or it holds wealthy people live there. And so we got clippings from the grass on a regular basis and brought to the gallery and dumped at the front entrance before you enter the show, like as you enter the show. These are the vitrines that we had built based on the vitrines that were in the photograph. But so the first vitrine is a fully functional vitrine with a door and this cavity inside of it. But the second vitrine essentially is a prop. You can't see that very well, but it's just open essentially. Does that make sense? You can see it? And then you can see the table leg is missing and the label. Everything starts to reduce in content. And finally, in the exhibition, this is behind the lion, so I also inserted things. Because my objective wasn't just to empty the gallery of content, but also provide more information. This is a part of always waterworks or in my practice. This is a Tupperware that's sitting on a moving crate on wheels. And in it is water with you can see there's a hose that just continuously pours water. It was interesting because the show was really, really dry. There was dust everywhere, and there's this kind of muddy line in the middle of the room. And water kind of it can be a filter in the room. It can kind of either hydrate the room or even actually clean the air. Those are some of the qualities. But in the case of this, these are water lilies, and that's in military terminology for creating safe zones in a cooperating country near one you want to invade. So you basically go and settle resources and weaponry, and then they guard it. And then when you want to invade a country, you basically, literally like a water lily, you go from one compound to another. That's your resources saved by another country. So it's called kind of like a lily pad military technique. In the case of this, it was just water lilies. But somehow it allowed permission for this fountain to enter the room. That's my desktop. Those are the only two pieces I wanted to show, or installations.
Did you learn things in the making of that show?
Again?
Did I learn things in the making of this show?
Yeah, because this is so different, of course.
I feel like everything I've done was a point of departure from, like everything, this show changed how I think. In the sense that it was like the exhibition, actually, to be transparent too, like it's been kind of a conflicting show because within my limits, it's the best work I've ever made, best, whatever that means. It outdid my expectation for how I see the exhibition. But then of course when you do your nice work, it might be nice to you, but if you don't get enough reviews or the show didn't tour, so it was also like a kind of a point of conflict where I was like, well, if this is the best I can do, and it doesn't merit that much attention, then it's like,
but you don't want to tour it.
yeah. I actually would. I would like the show to go to England because I think it's another place to inherit.
In crates.
No, I'll tell you. We have already. So the lion is biodegradable. It's made out of mud. And I'm actually going into a practice of cob sculptures. The lion I remake on location, and the only thing that gets shipped with water are the furnitures, and they've been dismantled into like they're all built to be taken apart. Yeah. Anyway, that's a long story.
Yeah, but it comes definitely out of a studio practice, this piece.
But I've never, no. I mean, I just worked in the gallery. It was a long time to make work, and
Okay. But I'm curious, why do you get a studio now? For
Pardon?
what? You told us that you are thinking about
getting the studio.
getting a studio,
You know what it is? It's,
getting a home.
yeah. It's because the studio is almost like a fermentation space. Like everything is porous and contagious in the studio. And accidents can become, I really think that studios were actually like precursors to abstraction. You put a piece of wood there, you're not thinking about it, and a flap of fabric, you come back, and over time, as company, you literally start to appreciate a composition that becomes a work or potential. So I've never had that capacity to just have stuff lie around and rub up against each other and maybe start to make meaning together.
Show it in your art.
Well, no, but there is, this is in Iraq already. So my objective was to like make...
The memory.
Yeah. So the objective was to actually have Americans, it was nice because a lot of people didn't know right away what the show was about. So as the sun started to set and the gallery got dark and the sconces were in there, it was nice because I got to see the photograph in time. And I also got to see its occupants, but not the ones from Iraq who come and see the ruin, essentially, or the loss of their civilization. And it was this moment where like it got kind of spooky in there. Because not only was I for the first time in the photograph we've been trying to produce, but there were other occupants that had never been there. And the work kind of shape-shifted. And, you know, with me and the curators we were in conversation with, I think I wanted to create, like, you walk into the doors, and this is the lobby of the museum, not the museum itself. So I like that kind of space of, because lobbies are transitional spaces too, right? So it was this kind of blurring of these two spaces where, like, the San Francisco Wattis Institute could be the lobby of the Baghdad Museum in a kind of a simultaneity of like a flickering moment in history where you open the door but you enter a portal. You know, so yeah, so I purposely produced the lobby of the Baghdad Museum and not only galleries. Does that? I think yeah. Whatever I learned, I haven't given it language yet. But yeah,
I'm just trying to understand. Is it that you are trying to understand things, and when you think you understand something, then you make a show. The show was what to point to something. So I'm just wondering, is that that's a continuous kind of process of pointing and learning? I mean, and do you look at a show like this and think, oh, I should have pointed to something else, like there's something missing?
Oh, without sounding arrogant, it was the water when it came into the room, it settled everything. And I had a friend from out of town visiting, and she got quite emotional about it. And that was what I learned. I mean, I learned a lot throughout the show from just either making the work. I'd never worked with cop sculpture or furniture design. So it was just working with people, and also I built the lion myself. I'd never made a sculpture that tall. It's 5.5 feet and it's about this wide. So I learned just literally the materiality of something. And it was interesting because it was the most basic way of making, right? A cob is basically straw and mud, a type of mud. And it starts with like literally nothing. And so this thing kind of came together in front of me and started to outgrow my height. And at one point, it was really kind of cheesy in a sentimental, nice way. I was trying to smooth out its forehead, and and somebody was watching me because I was in the gallery, and I think she thought I was petting it. And you are, like when you smooth out. But that moment, I had just finished the eyes, and I realized that it was looking at me. And it was this moment of like when something becomes its own creature, and then it kind of departs from your intentions. And I think that kind of animism is the hope of my relationship to materials. That there's a moment where it just kind of turns and becomes something else that I didn't expect. And that's when I said this show is so this is so stupid with the water, because it wasn't doing that. And then later on, when I turned off, kind of settled with the work, there was a moment where I just kind of thought, oh, it's kind of doing something I have to keep looking at to understand it. So it becomes a little bit more distant than I anticipated. I don't know what this show does. Yeah. I think I wanted to, talk about that kind of simultaneity of like, I mean, not to quote you twice, but you said wake up and think about the world as a whole. Is that how do Americans re-enter this space? How do we all re-enter this space? We're all responsible in some ways, to this kind of violence. Yeah, so what's been really interesting is that the gallery kept saying that people often come in and they'll apologize and turn around and leave because the show doesn't have the etiquette or the formality or the permission that they're used to in that space. So they'll come in and they think we're in between, and I wanted that feeling of like, is this a furniture store that's gone out of business? Or has there been a looting in here? Or is there an unfinished exhibition? And they said that often people will kind of open it up and be like, oh, sorry, we'll come back, or are kind of confused. There are no didactic panels. There's just like a small piece of paper that, and actually, for the sake of, I think you can be truthful without being too direct. The photograph is in a booklet that the curator wrote about, but the booklet is black and white, so the photograph is quite small and it's black and white, but it's not credited until the back of the book. So truth is there, but it's just revealed in these delays where you could see the photograph and kind of glance at it like, that's a document of the show. The actual photograph isn't there. But then when you read the back of it, you realize that it was a kind of a... And Kim Nguyen, is the curator, she wrote a really beautiful essay about injury. And it came to us because I was talking about this, and I don't read Rumi, I just heard this from somebody else and said, the wound is the source of light into the body. And so the wound is the source of light into the body.
That's cold comfort.
So she talked about that, like literally this kind of injury in an architecture or a body, but that every museum is essentially an injury because we come from looted other type. The work comes often from other looted nations that we go to look at. So there's inherent kind of pain and spaces. So she wasn't very illustrative about the work in a kind of a translating way. It was more abstract the way she wrote about it. Yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering, it's personal for you on a certain level, this show.
I'm invested in my work or the ideas in it.
Right, but I mean the sense of the museum that's been looted, a homeland, that kind of thing. As opposed to working, let's say, here, with being in a place that isn't necessarily personal. In fact, it isn't. It's not connected from where you are or from where you come from. And this part seems like a connection.
In some ways, it's the furthest place I've come
I'm
from.
asking about that.
Yeah. I was going to say, sorry, just to clarify, I'm Iranian, not Iraqi.
Yes.
But in some ways, like, I've never been to Iraq, and in many ways, I would say Iraq is the furthest place I've come from, in the sense that, like, because of that war, I agree with you, it's related to me.
It's closest, that's what I'm saying, closer
Yeah.
to, so when you said that this was one of your best works, I was wondering if that possibly could be, because we were talking about identity before, and possibly, and that was a question, could this be, you might feel this is one of your best works because it could be close to that.
That's not related to identity. I would say it's related to vicinity, maybe. And correct me if you disagree,
Yeah.
I'm happy to.
Oh, no, there's no.
Yeah. Because I think in some ways, for me, this work is a little bit more about empathy than anything. An act of, not even empathy, I hate that word now. I think it's a great word, but it's just been so used excessively now. It's like, how do you stretch to the furthest point against you? In some ways, like, every time I make work, I've been making work about Iraq for the last 10 years. Not Iraq as an isolated place, but Iraq as a place that was invaded by UK and America in 2003. Again and again, but this most recent one. That was part of my history as a person who was living in Montreal and was protesting with 1 million people. And so it's kind of like people's May 68 or something. They may not be from that period, or they might not have been in the May 68 in France, but they were within the vicinity of that kind of thing. Or it was a concurrent politics of their time. And I think having just moved to Montreal and witnessing that kind of movement, which obviously fell short of action, sadly, was formative for me. So I think yes, I agree with you. It's personal in that it's related to our histories and a history that I was alive and active in. But in some ways, every time I show work about Iraq, they write, Iraqi artist makes art about Iraqi plans. And this is like a journalist who's come there. We've talked about, they have my bio. But because they can't comprehend that act of like reaching to the enemy, potentially, right? So, yeah, I think, you can say the show at the Waters is as personal as the show at the Fogo, because I do, I just express all of my sentiment about home and coming home to this, blue house on an island. So I guess there's different compartments, but I would say that my narrative is not the objective of that work. A narrative that I'm part of is part of it.
I also don't understand it like this. But it's interesting looking to the ruins of our contemporary modernity. This is what makes it also into a political act more than this one. That makes it, I think, it's different from all the other works to me as well.
Yeah, that's part of the site specificity.
Less metaphorical.
It's funny, I was thinking about this work in relation to sculpture mostly.
I'm always interested in what matters, obviously. And it's funny what you just said. Did you just say you want to stretch to the furthest place against you?
Yeah, I'm a refugee of the Iran-Iraq war.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean that idea of stretch, that's a very powerful thing to say.
Oh.
Even if you weren't a refugee of that war, that would be all of us stretching to the furthest place against us. You have to decide what that is against you.
And in some ways you would say, like, it's the closest place to where I come from. So it's,
A little bit, yeah.
but just by vicinity. But actually, ideologically and politically, it was the furthest place at the same time. So it's that, a lot of my research started because Elaine Scarry has this beautiful book called The Body in Pain, and she kind of traces the root of the word house to hos, which is, it's the etymology for house, hospitality, hospital, but it's also hostage and hostility. So inherently, there's that potential of that kind of forking space. And that kind of, that the neighbor being the enemy also, or not. I don't know, just those things have been prevalent in my thinking for a long time. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, what do you most want to understand? That's too much to
I'll
ask.
send you an email in 10 years. Yeah.
But that spectrum from house to hostility, that is I think understanding what the game board is like that causes it to be one or the other is something that seems to be humans better friggin' figure out soon.
And it's interesting how much the house, whether hospitable or hostile, relates to the nation state. So when
That's
there is
the
a
important.
war, you have generations of the nation being beat up or participating in violence, and then that becoming kind of Russian dolled into every member of the house, from the parent to the child to the pet, pet back to the child. So it just becomes this kind of funneling of violence that enacts itself in so many complex and simple ways. But yeah, somehow, and I guess that's the inheritance I'm talking about when it comes to Iraq, for example. That museum is a placeholder for something else that's being inherited. And they are sculptures, they're not props, because none of them are, that's why the lion is not a kind of a 3D printed silhouette of just the outside. It's the heaviest object in the room. It's like a few tons. It's just made out of mud, so it's elemental still. It's like, and then there's also, to drive home the point of simultaneity, there's that green screen, which to me was a kind of a bracket between the most I really did thinking about the show as forms and sculptures. So green screen essentially to me right now is the most contemporary way of making sculpture. And cob is the oldest way of making architecture and sculpture. So we have two brackets of form pulling against each other.
about the work here, can you talk about, Alexandra you mentioned in your writing about this, the theatricality that exists in the part of the show that we saw here, and then of course there's the theatricality of the curtains. And so what is it that the curtain is supposed to be revealing to us? What are we supposed to understand about Fogo, your approach to Fogo, through the notion of theater?
So my relationship to Fogo is at best between the back door of the Wells house to that shoreline. That's how liminal my understanding of this space is. And then the entrance of the gallery to the back wall. It literally is that simultaneity that I would say I have any language for. I never drove when I came here in the past 2 visits. This is my first time I'm actually even exploring the landscape a little bit, though I'm not too keen on doing that too much. Like, I like the sedentary way of being here. I mean, Fogo in many ways is a kind of a stage right now, the island itself, right? That's why the curtains are not facing the houses, but rather facing the boats, where the arrival happens into the what's that called? The harbor. Thank you. Really good with the East Coast language over here. Clearly not a coastal person. So I think it's actually on a world stage right now as a perception, right? And I think what's really interesting about this place is, like, how do you reveal something without having it swarmed? And I think there's some infrastructure happening of that. I assume the best, I don't know. But yeah, I would say sculptures that are in language or in conversation with theater, I find them self-conscious as objects.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what the cast for Folly was also. Like, they were not props, they were too self-conscious to be props. They just used theatricality as a way to, cloak themselves, but also become more than just. And I think I wanted to use that self-consciousness about how this place is revealed or views itself, but also how it's, like, concealed. You could almost say that Fogo is like not really, but let's say potentially, is almost like akin to like a Sharjah in UAE or something, because people have deeply private lives that are not about the illustration for a tourist economy. And then people come there like, oh, these people are so rude. And I'm like, no, they're not interested in you being here because they have networks of families and closed houses and courtyards, and that's how life exists in this part of the world. So in many ways, I think, what's being revealed, or how is this place revealing itself? I think theater was a kind of a nice way to deal with it, but I think really it started from just observing the architecture and seeing that there's a coincidence between boat building, the houses that are built here, church and theater, but then also the way you and Todd conceived the gallery. The moment I walked in, I was like, so it's a low ceiling, this is where seating would happen, and then there's this throw stage, and then there's the window for like a light projection on the actor, essentially. So inherently there was something happening there that I thought, this is really exciting, yeah.
So then for that, the use of the light through what is a kind of a mimic of a stained glass window, which implies religion, but you say you're secular. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so, those things have become diluted. Like, a lot of artists make stained glass art, and they're not necessarily religious. I mentioned last night that stained glass is a strand board. I guess you guys call it oriented plywood, because they're in a... so it's just like shards of wood that are brought together into. So often when a window breaks, you block it with one of those woods because they're the cheapest wood and they have the most amount of glue, so they're water resistant. So this was just a very simple conflation of those two things. A glass that looks like, blah, blah, blah. But there were also, I was saying last night that there's certain economy to certain materials here that are not worth much, but they're of deep value because their lack would be heavily felt here. And strand board would be one of those things. So the whole show has a kind of a surface economy. The stained glass is a stained glass overlay. Of course, it's projecting light. And your comment last night was really nice. You mentioned that there's something about projection and almost like filmic with the hose reel looking like a film reel. We were supposed to have 2 of them, but it became too filmic, so I removed one to dilute that kind of. So I thought it would be nice to not have any light sources in the gallery. All the light bleeds through windows and openings, the front door and the upstairs. I wanted to have a religious connotations, but with a secular image that is actually relevant to the window itself. So things just kind of like package themselves in a way that justify their existence. But at the same time, that is also a trapdoor of a theater floor, right? Or the trapdoor of a stage, potentially. So there's just kind of like these, I was thinking like kind of gathering meaning into one surface or space. And then the stage made out of material called Meranti, which is basically door skin. So that's the most superficial, cheap way of making something look. You would basically put that on top of the strand board to make it look nice if you build a door or like a wall or something. So they both have a kind of a economy about them.
And an integrity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's consistent.
Absolutely.
And complete.
Yeah. That the economy is not. Yeah, it's not derogatory at all. I think there's a kind of a frankness about it, both of them. Yeah, and then I was talking about the snake, the hose as a snake as well.
Yes.
Which is of great significance here. But as you saw with the oscillating water sprinkler, I've been working with hoses for quite some time.
And to be clear, because snakes have significance because there are no snakes.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, Kingman's dog found. She's very tricky. She just like gradually went over. I don't know. She just kind of like went over and picked up this thing, and I was like, oh my god, she found a big piece of snake skin, like shed. And then Earl was like, that's fish skin. And I was like, oh, like very like just like he was like, there's no snakes here. And I was like, no, really, I think it's. I was like, that's fish skin. I was like, yeah, I forgot. But then also like, there's a kind of an Edenistic narrative of the snake that determines what lives and dies, and who's expelled and who's kept. And so I wanted that to be space as a kind of a placeholder for a garden hose, but also this kind of prejudice device. It's interesting, I had the water sprinkler there partially because in Vancouver I learned, gardens are such symbolic, interesting spaces, and they can be very generous, but they can also be very manipulative, as we all know. In Vancouver, we were sitting at a kind of a common public beach, and as the sun was setting, all these sprinklers came on. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. There was grass, so we were like, oh, they're watering the grass. And then gradually I was like, no, this is to prevent the homeless from sleeping. This is the hour. So it's like this kind of super, refined way of
control.
The hostility and hospitality. Yeah, so the oscillating water sprinkler, which to me was a kind of a, anyway, it's a long story. Formally, it's like a snake and a peacock put together. It was kind of referencing those things of prejudices of.
The peacock's feathers being the flow of the water.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a best time to see the work downstairs?
No, it's the same light
Between
all
12
the
and
time.
9.
It's a dark, it's a dark space.
So it's lit with artificial lighting from the library.
Right.
Plus the exit.
Plus the exit sign.
I wandered in later when there was no one in the room, and it felt very different.
Yes, I
It
think
felt
it needs.
overwhelming and beautiful. I could hear the water better, and
Exactly. I think it
It
needs
had
these
a
moments
feeling.
of loneliness and silence at the same
Yes.
time, and not with others.
I
agree.
I had two references, other than quite a few. But one was immediately the prayer room at the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld's prayer room that he built for anyone who comes into the UN to have a place for peace. And it's got a mural that looks very much like a little modernist stained glass there and light coming down. So that was one of my first, and I like that feeling. And the other one was Soylent Green, when, what's his name, he's on the gurney and he's going in for euthanasia. And they bring him into the room, and you get to choose your music, and you get to choose the film in front of you as you're about to pass. And going in, this of course is the stage, of course, and so they, Edward G. Robinson, comes in, and he chooses yellow, as the cloak and all the nurses are in yellow, and they just bring him in, and in front is, it's all landscape, and it's the pastoral, Beethoven's pastoral being played.
Yeah.
So going into this space with this stage, and just, it was kind of a cinematic moment, which of course is your theater thing going on, but I had that thing going on too. And both were enjoyable, you know, it was good.
Yeah, we were trying to make something kind of precarious and, you know, rough. I did ended up looking kind of like a weird Japanese water garden or something. You know, like it kind of goes there sometimes if you stand at the right angle. But then often it's just, it feels like a drawing in the room or something. So I'm glad that it's doing stuff that I kind of didn't foresee maybe. Or I mean, I wanted some life in the room, but I didn't, because I think it's missing, aside from the water, obviously. So at first there were plans to having like some sort of plants in the water, like small plant life. But actually the stones became the most interesting subjects on their own, and they're stationary kind of. Yeah, so it was a nice way to get away from the plant. Easier to keep alive too.
Well, unless there are any pressing questions, I'll probably leave it there. But of course, there's some coffee and snacks, and we can continue the conversation.
Thank you, Iris.